Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host. It's our third annual Oscar series, where film industry professionals discuss the category of their expertise. And today is episode 4 of 10. We're releasing 2 episodes per week, and that'll take us right up to the 94th Academy Awards on March 27th. This episode, we're talking about animated feature, and I've got a couple of industry veterans to offer their insights. First, welcoming back to the show, Kent Seki. You're a 20-year Hollywood veteran, and your animated credits include Megamind, Peabody and Sherman, and The Boss Baby. Nice to see you again.
Hey, it's great to be here, Skid. Thanks for having me.
Next, Camila Ganza. You've been working on animated films for more than 20 years yourself, with credits including The Incredibles, The Secret of Kells, and, going back to your start in the industry, The Iron Giant. Welcome to Below the Line.
Thanks, Skid. I'm super happy to be here.
Well, I'm really happy to have you both here. This is always a fun category to review. Listeners, if you want to learn more about my guests, please look them up on the Internet Movie Database. Below the Line has its own page on IMDb, so it's easy to start on a specific episode and simply click through to see their film credits. The 5 animated films recognized by the Academy this year are Encanto, Luca, Raya and the Last Dragon, The Mitchells vs. the Machines, and Flea. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this a warning. Let's jump right in with Encanto. Tell me what you thought about this film.
So Encanto is a really interesting movie. What do you think, Camille? I mean, in terms of like from a Disney standpoint, it takes place in Colombia. It has it's very faithful to the Latin American experience, and it features. It's probably the year of Lin-Manuel Miranda, so it features many of his all of his songs from him, and the hit song "We Don't Talk About Bruno."
Absolutely, yeah. I love Encanto. It was the only film I saw in the theater last year with my daughter, and it's been nonstop played at my house since then. So I'm very familiar with Encanto. But yeah, I think it's a really beautiful film. I think it's colorful. The music was great, and it was a really moving story.
Yeah, it's fascinating on the story side. It's different from a lot of Disney movies because it doesn't have an outright villain. Like, people have talked about this. This has been discussed heavily sort of in the industry, especially in the context of Disney, which, I mean, the arch villain is a classic Disney trope, let's just say. And in this one, they've really shied away from that. It's a really interesting, different kind of film because of that. I think that one of the fascinating things about it is that when the filmmakers talk about this movie, it has a magical background. It has magic as part of the whole. Powers and magic are part of thematically of it. But they discuss it when they discuss the film as a whole. They said it has to work without the magic, which then points back to what is it, the core story that is sort of holding it all together, and really is the story of family, which a lot of animated films are about family. Let's face it, that's sort of a thing in a lot of animated, especially 4-quadrant animated films. But this one, it really has the family dynamic as its core sort of central theme. And I think that's why a lot of people can relate to it, is because it does have these different roles that people play in a family. The favorite, there's sort of the outcast, the one that holds it all together, the one that has all the expectations placed on them. Like, all of those are sort of roles are fulfilled in this film.
Yeah, I agree. I think the family dynamic was really beautiful in this film, and even the house being a character. I found the house to be really charming and actually one of my favorite parts of the movie. And I was happy it came back at the end. Sorry, there will be spoilers.
There will be spoilers.
There will be spoilers. But I mean, I think musically, it's wonderful. You know, I think Disney has found just such magic with Lin-Manuel Miranda that, you know, they are kind of recapturing from like the glory of the Lion King, Little Mermaid days. Mm-hmm. And it's, yeah, my daughter was singing Surface Pressure yesterday, like all day. So it really is just 24/7 at my house.
You touched on something, Camille, that I agree with as far as like from a technical standpoint. For me, the house is almost a show stealer for me in terms of like when I watch Disney, especially Disney animated films. they do such a great job of infusing anthropomorphic qualities into something like a rigid, like what we call a rigid body object, like a house is made out of bricks and stone. And it's like the kind of thing that's hard to move. Like, so you have to come up with different rules and ways to make the house feel like a person almost and move around in a way that's sort of still believable. It has to exist in the physics of the world that it lives in. And the house steals the show for me. When I'm watching it, I was really enchanted by the house itself. And it reminded me of some of the older Disney stuff, like Fantasia, in which they do the same kind of thing. They infuse a lot of anthropomorphic qualities into things that like aren't really alive. And like, I think that is one of the things that's really special about the film, that when viewers watch it, they should really take note of like how much you buy the house. Like, I think that's, you know, people have seen superpowers and magic, but like the house having such personality, I think it's not an easy feat, especially because of the scale of the house versus a person and all the different views of the house. You know, you're either inside, you're outside, you're close up. You rarely see the house as a whole from a wide standpoint. So the things you would do, but creating a face, are not what's used in sort of personifying the house. And I think that's a real great animation trick. And it also speaks to what we call rigging, which is the technical part of animation in which a 3D object is given controls and bones, and it allows the animator to move them in a way that has feeling. And so that is not easy. Like, that is something that's super challenging on a technical level, but they are very successful in doing it in terms of like the individual tile work that moves sometimes, or it's a door, or it's a doorknob, or the windows. Like, all of those little things are pretty fantastic in how they made those things happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I'm just imagining, you know, who rigged that house, or the people that rigged that house.
Right, the team of people that rigged the house,
team of
right?
people. Just, you know, because I think when people watch it, you know, you're looking at this beautiful house, but when you have all these pieces that move, you know, somebody designed it, somebody built it, somebody rigged it, somebody surfaced it,
right?
You know, so there's just so much work that goes into it. And yeah, I wish I could see the rigging.
The behind the scenes rigging on that.
Yes.
The other thing I thought was sort of notable in this film overall is the character design. So one of the things that has happened in the industry as a whole is there's a movement away from the idealized characters or fetishized characters. And these are really, like, especially the women are portrayed as real women. Like, they have curves, they are different shapes and sizes, and they're celebrated for those shapes and sizes, which I think is a big change at Disney from the princess tropes of the past. And if you look at the character designs of Mirabelle, she wears glasses, she's a full-figured woman. I think all these things are actually really to be applauded, because the more you can project yourself as a regular person into a film, the more you can relate to it. And it sends a very good message in terms of who can be a heroine or who can be a hero in a film. And I thought that was a really great difference in this film from other ones I've seen in the past, especially like this kind of film from Disney. And I was really happy to see that.
Definitely. I mean, you see different shapes, sizes, colors, you know, just, you know, the fact that it is in Colombia, it's just, you know, it's a different origin of story for Disney. And
right.
I think it's a great representation of culture from South America.
I do know that along those lines, they took a trip down, a bunch of the filmmakers who went to Colombia for some period of time to do some research. And that's something that does happen from time to time in animated films, especially if you go from a Disney or a Pixar, where they really spend a lot of time on research. And I think it creates that authenticity that you really want in a film. And I think it really shows in this film in terms of like the way it looks. And that's something that's, I'm always amazed at Disney at how much time they spend in making something look great. And this is no exception. I also think the animation style is the classic Disney animation style. There's underlying comedy, a lot of squash and stretch. The Bruno character, which the famous song is about, I think he steals the show, to be honest. I think John Leguizamo's voice is fantastic. And not everyone's a great voice actor. You can have a great sort of, you know, actors that just don't work out as well for whatever reason. They don't translate as well into animation. And his voice is fantastic. And I think that his voice paired with his classic Disney squash and stretch animation, and it's just that right amount where it's not too cartoony, but it feels right for the film. I think that when it comes to character pipeline and design, Disney's by far heralded in the industry as like top notch. Like, they have a kind of a style which people could talk about, and I think that they're known as the appealing character. That's the way that they're been painted. But it is true. Like, the characters have a lot of appeal, that they They look great from every angle, that the shape language really works for each of them. And especially in a film which is untraditional in terms of the shapes of the characters, they really did a great job of getting that all right.
Yeah, I agree. John Leguizamo was fantastic, and just the character of Bruno, everything about him was so fantastic, because they don't talk about Bruno, but you hear so much about Bruno in the film, and then when you learn, he's actually not this scary character. He's this heartwarming, charming, sad character who's been living behind the wall to protect Mirabelle the whole time. When they showed that little, his little table and the plates and the knife and the spoon that he'd carved in so that he could, have dinner with his family. I mean, it kind of broke my heart.
I mean, the staging of that is great. Like, that's another thing about this. That's where you have design and layout, which is the department that I work in, like really working together, where you feel the connection between these two separate spaces, right? And so it starts with design, but then it comes together through story, which is storyboarding, and then finalized sort of in the layout department, where you shoot it in a manner that connects these two disparate spaces and makes them feel one. And I think that's really a great scene and a great example of great layout there. Also, most people don't realize this in animated films that are especially musicals, there are choreographers they hire to do the dance numbers. So like, there's oftentimes a choreography be hired, and they film the choreography done by the choreographer, and then the animators interpret that choreography when they create the dance numbers. And that's something that's super challenging and interesting to me, because I've never done a musical personally. So the thought of like, oh, we have to find this choreographer who's going to define the dance, but then you have to make selections from that dance to make it work for the animated environment. Like, all of that works together and in this film in a very amazing way.
Boss Baby wasn't a musical, Kent?
I'm afraid Skin that Boss Baby was not a musical.
I'm thinking of another film, I guess, that I'm getting it mixed up. I want to ask you both to talk a little bit more about the animation of this. So we're going to be talking about Disney quite a bit today. This is the first of their nominations on the list. Are they using a sort of a house style in this approach, some of the things you mentioned that are typical of Disney films, or are there aspects of this animation that are unique to this film?
No, I think this film really embodies the classic Disney style of 3D computer animation in terms of what they've done in the past. But that's not in a pejorative sense. I think that they're fantastic at it. They're generally known as a great character animation house. I think that that's sort of, one of their big pillars in terms of how they're perceived in the industry. And I think they did a great job. I just think that it's a classic sort of thing. And it's interesting because we're going to compare this to the other ones from the Disney world, which is Raya and Luca, even though Luca's from Pixar, but they're all under the Disney umbrella. And they're really, to me, they feel very different. And I mean this in a good way. Like, I think that's great that you can have different styles embodied in different movies because they're appropriate for the film that they are. But I think this is a classic Disney, for me at least. I don't know, Camille, if you agree with that, or if you saw something that stood out as different.
I would agree with you. I think it is classic Disney. I think it's it's a heartwarming story with beautiful animation and beautiful design just all around. So, Disney's known for great storytelling and great design. And I feel like everything about Encanto is that, it's just this beautifully told story that touches you. If you have a family, if you've had any kind of feelings in life,
in life in general,
you should enjoy it.
One interesting thing about the film are the use of effects is actually quite good. And when I say effects, I mean the simulation. So every time you see a sparkle or a magic effect where something falls, like they're using some kind of simulation software to make that happen. And there's a lot of, since the characters are magical, there is a lot of it in the film, a lot of glowy things, all those are all done by artists who are using and trying to come up with different ways of using simulation software to embody these different characters' powers. And they do a fantastic job of that. I think that is something that is another aspect of the film that I thought was really well done. With the Sims were really well done on this one.
And I think the production design was fantastic too, because if you think of all the different powers and the rooms behind each of the magical doors, I mean, they're all really unique and representative of the characters.
Yeah,
they live within that world and are believable, but they're all super unique. So I really enjoyed that piece too.
So like Disney makes a superhero movie without it being a superhero movie, essentially, is what's happened here. Like you have that story that happens in the sort of behind the scenes of this one, for me at least.
Do you have a favorite song, Kent?
I have to say the catchiest song for me is "We Don't Talk About Bruno." I mean, come on, like that's the one that you're like, it's pretty funny and it's really well done. I don't know. What about you, Camille? You are someone who loves the song.
I do. I really enjoy Surface Pressure. That is my favorite, and I also love the animation in that song. Because they kind of spin off into that dream world where the sister is carrying the world and going through all of this in her mind, floating through the clouds were they little unicorn donkeys? I really enjoyed that.
The unicorn donkeys.
Yes.
We would be remiss without saying like this film. A lot of times we ask in the world of animation, when you work in the animation industry, it's like, why does this have to be animated? Why isn't it not a live action movie? Especially nowadays when anything can be done in a live action movie. And for me, a lot of it's the house. Like the house itself would be, you could do a CG house, but like to make it fit within the world, I think it really needed to be animated and to feel animated. And I think that's, at least for me, when I look at the film, like that's the world building of the house is a unique character and would not translate as well into a real life, like practical house or even like a CG version of a practical house. I just don't think it would have the same charm.
Yeah. Animation brings the magic.
That's good.
We'll move on to the second film on our list. As we mentioned earlier, it's also from Disney under the Pixar label, but that would be Luca.
I really liked Luca. I felt it was an interesting movie, especially because the stakes are so low. Like in some ways, all of our movies have gotten to the point where we're saving the world or all these things are happening. And really, in some ways, it takes away from the personal story. And Pixar always brings things back to a person, even like a bigger movie like The Incredibles, where there's a lot of superheroes and things. There's always a personal story in it. And Luca really has that. And I think the story of these two friends that's underlying it, and the idea of friendship and leaving one's home, I think those things are very real things, real issues that kids deal with, that even adults like deal with, the evolution of friendship. I think that is something that's really great in this film. And the director is actually Italian. So I've heard interviews with him, and his best friend was also named Alberto. And so he tells this funny story where he went to Italy to promote the film, and he met up with his best friend Alberto from Italy, who he grew up with. And Alberto has a 2-year-old. Alberto's son sees this, or daughter, I forget which one it was, but sees the film and says, "Well, does Alberto see Luca again?" And he could tell his kid, yes, he does. They do see each other again. So I think in a lot of ways, it's a super personal film, and I think it shows. I think it shows in how the film feels, and especially the ending when the spoiler alert, Luca leaves essentially his best friend to go to school, and it's this sort of almost sad moment. It's a melancholy moment, but it's, I think, a lot about life in that way of like your friendships when you're children, and kids and adolescents, even teenagers, like they evolve over time, and your life goes on, and sometimes you do grow apart. I mean, not in a bad sense of like you drift apart, but that you actually have to go your different separate ways. And I think I think it's a great story to tell, because everyone has to deal with that in their life in some way, shape, or form at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I thought Luca was they're all beautiful. They're all just absolutely beautiful films, but it is this kind of smaller, compact story that's limited to this certain area in Italy, and then in the ocean off of the coast. The sea monster world and the Italian world.
Yes.
Vespas.
Yes. Vespas. Lots of Vespas.
and just this kind of, a lot of Vespas.
A lot of Vespas.
And, this kind of idealized, like 1950s, 1960s setting, that these kids live in. And it does capture that magical piece of childhood where you're growing and learning and just, having that super tight bond of friendship as you're growing up.
Right.
And then having that loss at the end.
Yeah.
It's good that they got, in real life, they get back together, because they did. It was a little sad at the end.
A little sad at the end.
It was. But, I think it's beautiful. And I think when it opens, Pixar amazing with water, first of all, by the way,
Right.
because
I
if
mean,
you look at like Finding Nemo or Finding Dory, you know, they've been doing that for a long time. And so when we open up and we're in that underwater world, it's absolutely ridiculous. Like
yeah,
it's so
totally ridiculous.
beautiful and well done. That's not easy.
No, it's and that's sort of interesting. There are little subtleties that the audience or listeners should listen to or watch. And that is when you watch the fluidity of everything in the underwater world, and even with the camera work, it's different from the rigidity or the different camera style outside. And it's that contrast, right? So there's the thing that we talk about in animation all the time, which is contrast and affinity. Like those are the two pillars of like that create the movie in a visual style. Like you have some things that feel fluid in this film and other things that feel more rigid. And those two worlds, you know, coming together is the interesting sort of tension, right? And it's funny because the head of layout, that's my job that I do on a film, is a person that I know, David Bianchi, who worked at PDI. And he sent me this picture of him doing research before he shot the film, in which he was literally in the pool with a camera and flippers filming, seeing what it's like to shoot something underwater. And it's that attention to detail that I love in a Pixar movie. Like it's just the camera underwater is subtly moving almost always. And shots that you think are lock-offs, meaning you think that the camera's on a tripod or just not moving at all. It's actually subtly moving, which it gives you and infuses the shot with this underwater feeling. And the hair, you know, like all the little things that are their hair moving slightly underwater, like all those things are happening in those scenes. And I think it's really beautiful to me to see it and to sort of feel it. And it's technically for me, I'm like, wow, he went through all those shots and made sure those were all moving a little bit. I gotta make sure and call David and talk about it with him to see how he went about doing that. But it's really a fantastic little detail that I think it could easily be missed, but it's really, really nice in there. But can we talk about the mouth shapes for a second? Can we just talk about mouth shapes on this film are bananas? Like they're really, really cool. And what I mean by that, they're totally different. So, okay, when I say mouth shapes, I'm talking about the actual shape the mouths make when they're talking and emoting. They're so circular, which is very different than most animated films where you have a lot of sharp corners. It's the influence, I think, a lot of anime and comic books and cartoons and Miyazaki in here. Like, so this has been talked about a lot is the influence of Miyazaki on this film. Like, so when I say Miyazaki, we're talking about the legend in Japan anime of Miyazaki, who did Spirited Away, who won the Oscar for Spirited Away, who's considered the Fellini, I guess, of Japanese anime, if I had to sort of describe. He's retired like 20 times. I'm not joking. I think he's making another film right now, but like we can joke about that. But like he keeps saying he's going to retire, he comes back. But the influence of his style on this filmmaker is very evident in the township that it's made. Like there literally is a film that looks like this town that Miyazaki has done. Even the name of the town, I think Porto Rosa, which is same as Porto Rosco. There was another Miyazaki film that had a very similar named town. So I think that there's a lot of nods to Miyazaki. And in the character design, if you look at the character design, for example, Luca, I believe, has big eyes and a smaller mouth, right? And if you look at his friend, Alberto, he has a big mouth and smaller eyes. Like, so that's all done on purpose to sort of contrast their personalities. Like Luca's is the more hesitant one and is a little shy. And he's coming out of a shell, whereas Alberto has a lot of bravado, so his mouth's bigger. So those little subtle things are imbibed into the character design, which I think is unusual in our CG world. Like generally, it's harder to do that kind of stuff than it is to do something that looks more realistic, even though there's the uncanny valley. Like from a character design perspective, making something that's super circular in the mouth and make it work is really challenging, super challenging.
I think another thing to note about Luca is just how painterly the production design, backgrounds, and characters are. If you watch it, there's not as many details. So that kind of realistic animation style that can happen in a lot of CG films, like it's not there, but it's a really purposeful decision. And so every shot kind of looks like a painting.
Right.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's unusual for Pixar. So if you look at the canon of Pixar, like especially Toy Story, like was it 4, which everything's so super realistic, to like move away from that to a more painterly style is unusual. And it actually shows a lot of, growth is not the right word, but it shows a lot of risk taking on their part. Because in order to move away from that, you're moving away from your general pipeline in terms of like all of the software development you've done over the years is sort of building on top of each other. And when you go for something that's different, that means you're willing to throw some of that away and develop new things that maybe just for this film alone. And I think that painterly look, and it's almost like watercolor in some of the texture or surfacing detail, that you can just sort of feel it. Like you can feel almost a watercolor paper in the walls of the frescoes and stuff that you really feel in this film. That you can feel the concept art coming out, oozing onto the screen in this thing. And I think that's a real great quality in this. The other thing that happens in this is and when we talk about animation, specifically character animation style, it's super cartoony. Like there's way more squash and stretch, let's say, in this one than in our previous film that we're talking about, Encanto. There's even multi-limbs, and multi-limbs is a technique in animation which sort of mimics comic books or cartoons, in which a character is moving very fast, and so it's motion blurring. But then you see, instead of 1 or 2 legs, there's like 4, and they literally have frames with like 4 legs. And your eye sort of blurs them together as you're watching it. But if you stop on a frame, they're doing multi-limb in there, and that's really great. It's really a fun thing to do. Like when they take the Vespa down and it jumps off of that little jump, and they're in the air, and then for a second they're a little bit longer than a second it feels, they're in the air and they're flailing about. You can see multi-limb happening, and that's a really fun thing to do and see especially in a Pixar film.
Yeah, and I was reading just some of the things they had to invent, just kind of going back to the painterly look, the transformation software between the sea monster and then the boys, like transforming that rig, going back to the rig, from a sea monster rig to a human character rig, that software didn't exist. And so that's something that they had to invent for this film. And it's really quick and subtle, and probably wouldn't notice it. But it's a big deal. And I think with every film, every film that Pixar makes, or Disney or DreamWorks, there's always this technology that's being pushed forward, and making things better.
Right. And Pixar's known for their proprietary tools, their commitment to constantly pushing the envelope. And I think this film is no exception, but in a different way, like in a really different sort of look than where they were going before. If you compare the look of like the backgrounds compared to like Soul or Toy Story 4, it really is different in that way. And I think it's super special. Another interesting thing about the film is so the director, Enrico, he had directed La Luna, which is another short film for Pixar. It was a beloved short film, and the listeners should watch it. It's really great, but it's great to compare that film to this one. It's a very lyrical, it's almost like a poem. I don't believe there's any dialogue in it. And to take the aesthetic or the feeling of that and infuse it into a feature film without losing the audience. Like you can do things in a short film, like make it more poetic. It's like the difference between a poem and a novel, right? You have to sort of find a way to take the lyricism of the short film and infuse it. It's not at all related, but there's a feeling that permeates both of these films to me when I compare the two, that really is evident. So the hand of the filmmaker is very evident here. And I thought that was super successful in his, interpretation. I think both takes place in Italy. So like but again, that's the authenticity to your own experience. And I think that's something that's really great. Another interesting thing that I've read over the course of the time this film's been out is the question of the sexuality of the two main characters, right? And so I think it'd be remiss if you don't talk about this a little bit. And when asked about this, Enrico says, well, it's really based on my life, which is my best friend. But he was super happy to hear that the LGBTQ community had embraced this film in that way. And I think that's another powerful thing about cinema and animated films too, because I think there's a lot of ability to project yourself into these films. I think because they're animated, I think it allows for that interpretation. And at the end of the day, I think that's okay. I like it when people have different interpretations of films than the original creator. I think that's really great. I think it's one of the things about art in general, that's you bring to it your own experience. And I think that owning your own identity, whether it's as a sea monster or as an LGBTQ community member, I think those things are universal. And I think great films have universal appeal because of those things. And I know it was a big thematically for him. Owning your identity was one of the big things about this film. And I think he was very heartened to hear about that embrace.
Yeah, I think if you see yourself in any of these characters, you're able to take that with you. And so for, people who see themselves in these characters, whether they're, part of the LGBTQ movement or not, like it's personal, and it goes back to Enrico's story. Like this is a very personal story of growth. And I think it's wonderful to see this kind of inclusion in a film. And I think we can say that about all of them, but maybe we can save that for the end.
Well, let's also say that the world's weirdest triathlon in this film. Let's just talk about that for a second. Very strange triathlon, but hey, I love it.
Well, Disney scored a third nomination this year with Raya and the Last Dragon.
Raya, to me, is that okay? So we've looked at Luca, and we said that one was more cartoony. And then if I said in context of classic Disney, this one has, in terms of an animation style, feels like a more of a realism show, simply because of a lot of the martial arts that take place in here, right? So it actually distinguishes itself from the other two in that way, and it not in a better or worse, but just different. And it shows the talent of the studio to embrace these different styles of animation that are appropriate for the films they are about, right? So this one, Raya, it has a lot of that classic fight scenes in it that feature martial arts. And in order to do that, you have to have some believability in the physics. Even if they do impossible things, you have to believe that the characters can do it. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where I look at these three films. I'm like, wow, there really are three different, very distinctive animation styles in terms of the character animation. And this one has that realism. I think the martial arts sequences are pretty spectacular. They're really interesting for me to watch from a choreography standpoint. I'm sure they must have had reference or fight choreography come in and do some examples for them of like how these moves could work. That's the only way you get to have them feel this good in a film.
I thought Raya was a beautiful film, just absolutely stunning and different. I loved just the opening. She's completely badass. Riding around the desert. Looking for that last piece of Sisu or whatever.
The gem.
The gem. Sorry.
Yeah.
And so it was really contrasted between Aquafina and Sisu. Right? Like I think that it's super realistic, but then you have this like completely bonkers dragon.
Right. As soon as you go to the dragon world,
funny.
It's pretty funny. She's funny. She's really funny as the dragon. It's good. Almost borderline like anachronistic, but not quite. When she talks about like, we do the class project, but I'm the one who doesn't really do as much work. I get the same grade as everybody else. Like that's a funny line in there that I have a good time with for sure. For me, the character of Tuk Tuk is the one that really it's like a giant pill bug that turns into like a wheel. I think there's something really great. A giant armadillo or sorts that meets a pug is pretty great. And so we've been talking about rigging to rig that would be a very big challenge in terms of being able to make it become a ball. I'm sure they had multiple versions of it, and then roll along, then unfurl. Like that is not easy to do. And to be convincing, that's super challenging in a lot of ways. But I like that character design is really great. I think it's a really cool looking fantasy character. Other things that stand out about Raya for me is the world building. It is literally 5 worlds that are built for this film. And to be able to do that on that scale is impressive. It's not easy to do that level of world building in 3D. And we talked about from a design, modeling, surfacing, lighting, all of it together to create these convincing environments of where people live and these worlds. It's not easy at all. This too, actually, so talking about villains, there's these kind of ambiguous creatures that are the villains. Again, it's sort of moving away from the Disney style of an arched villain. Like it's kind of an existential threat more so than maybe it's sort of timely that we have so many existential threats now in our actual lives that there's an existential threat of like these creatures that we don't really know much about that are just going to destroy everything. Like that is interesting. Another interesting choice for Disney in terms of the villain, same as Encanto being no villain, right? So now you have this existential one. And in some ways, Luca has the quintessential Disney villain in the sort of the person they have to defeat in the triathlon at the bully, right?
I didn't like that guy.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing about Raya is that the villain is not a typical Disney villain.
Well, and just to go back on what you were saying about the five worlds, I was reading that just a little shout out for the crowds department at Disney. They animated 72,000 individual elements, which included, over 18,000 human characters.
Wow.
And then 35,000 non-human characters. That's a lot.
So for people, for the uninitiated, the crowds are actually done by a department. There's almost always a crowds department, but it's actually a sum total of a lot of departments to do crowds. You have to come up with the system to generate enough variation in the characters themselves so they don't look repeated. And so almost all the major studios have a crowd or a generic system in which they literally mix and match different materials for their cloth, their clothing, and face shapes and heights and limb lengths and like eye color, hair color, in order to create a pastiche, if you will, where the production owner has to go through and the art director go through and they select which ones they want. And then there's like an algorithm they develop in order to propagate it through these, all of these scenes. And then the crowd department has to animate cycles that can be repeated without looking repetitive for all the crowds. And then they have to be dispersed and moved throughout the entire scene. So there's a lot of, it's really where animation meets technical meets art, right? You have all these things coming together in the crowd department. There's a separate character department that does character animation per se. And there's actually some trade-offs between the two to help sort of bridge the gap. But it's a department unto itself. And when you have epic crowds in an animated film, there's a whole department devoted just to doing that.
Yeah. And usually it's for one world, but since they do have those 5 distinct worlds, like they had to do, kind of 5 separate
kinds of crowds. Right? So they have different clothing types, different body types, different looks, like all those things. It just adds up. It should also be noted that this film was started before the pandemic. And actually, this was the one where Disney had to figure out how to finish the movie when everyone had to go home. And from a technical standpoint, that is a big lift. You're talking about a studio who has a tradition in working at the studio. And then everyone went home. And so they had to figure out the remote working method. And they were able to sort of go through and do it. And I read somewhere that some people felt there was even more camaraderie because of that, because people felt that they were up against the same problem together to try to finish this movie. And I think that no matter what, that infuses the film with some kind of feeling, right? That it does sort of permeate the film. And during the pandemic, animation was one of the only types of production that could keep going because of the technology, which is sort of fascinating in a lot of really weird and strange ways. I think there was a huge explosion or growth within the animation industry because of the pandemic, which probably, no one foresaw until it happened.
Yeah, I think the pandemic actually moved animation forward like 5 or 10 years. Like we may have been working like this in the future, but this happened, simply because of the pandemic. But I think all these films were finished during the pandemic.
Yes. I think that they were all of these, I think were some, yeah. In fact, I know Mitchell's was too. Yes. I would bet that was the case. Yeah.
But it's been amazing, just that shift from studio to working from home to working from wherever, and what that has meant for our industry as a whole.
The industry as a whole is grappling with it right now to try to see what does it mean to come back after the endemic, or however you want to say it, when this thing settles down, if it ever settles down. What is the industry going to look like at that point? I think that remains to be seen. But I think that the growth and the choices have now gotten much larger as a result of that because of what happened during the pandemic. It should also be noted, I read this, and this is something that is really interesting about this film, is that it features an all-female technical leadership team. And that is unusual in the world of animation. And I think that's something to be applauded because I think it's about time something like that happened. Animation school is predominantly women. I think the majority of people that go to animation school are women.
Now.
Yeah, now, but yet the leadership doesn't reflect that yet. And the question is, when is that going to happen? And I think this film should be marked for the fact that it did feature, and especially on the technical side, it seems even like a bigger hurdle to overcome for studios to like really sort of dig in and make it right. And I think this is a big mark in the sand in terms of a studio that they put their money where they were supposed to do it, and it should be noted because it looks great and it's technically fantastic. So, you know, I was really impressed to see that Disney had done that.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, you know, overall, most of the studios are really leaning into that and trying to have more inclusive workforces, just, you know, increasing representation across the board, because that's how we get good stories.
Right.
You know,
right.
And I think that even with the pandemic, like that has opened up the whole world, you know, because we're working with artists all around the world and hearing different stories and meeting new storytellers. And so, you know, that's just something that I don't know that would have happened as quickly.
I think you're 100% correct. What I've noticed also is the ability for someone remote to say, hey, doesn't feel right to me. You know, so it sort of checks the filmmakers a little bit on preconceived notions about places or people or things, that I think allows a little more accountability, even on the micro level, on the day-to-day review level. I've seen it happen, and I think that's super important. And we can talk about all the good or bad of Zoom, but one of the good things about Zoom is it's a great equalizer, right? It allows someone who's maybe not a little bit more introspective, who doesn't want to put themselves out there in a large room of people, to be able to have a voice, because it's not always the loudest person in the room speaking as the loudest person in the room. Sorry.
Oh boy. No, but it's true. And it's true because in animation, you know, when you're in these review rooms, you know, you're in a review room with a lot of people who have been working at a studio for X number of years. And so if you are a newer voice in the room, you may not raise your hand, you know, you may not feel comfortable, you know, with that production executive, you know, voicing your opinion. But I think in these, you know, virtual rooms, it is an equalizer, you know, because all you have to do is raise your little hand button and maybe chime in.
I think it does change the dynamic, right?
It does. It absolutely does.
The first of our films that is not under the Disney umbrella is The Mitchells vs. the Machines. It was produced by Sony Pictures and distributed by Netflix.
I loved Mitchells vs. the Machines. I absolutely was totally into this film. I laughed probably more at this film than a lot of other films I've seen in a long time. It came at the right time, probably for me during the pandemic. And it has a great message about technology and family. Again, another family theme one, right? So It's the road trip during the apocalypse. So it's a family road trip during an apocalypse. Like that's really sort of what it's about, right? It's brought to you by directors Mike Randa and Jeff Rowe, who were the team behind Gravity Falls. So if you were a fan of Gravity Falls, the TV series, these guys went on to make this one. This is their first feature. And in a lot of ways, it feels like their first feature. And I mean this in the best way possible. I think that this story was bubbling it feels like it's been bubbling for a long time. It has a kitchen sink feeling to it, which I think is great. Like, I don't mean that again as a pejorative sense. I think it's what gives the film the charm it has. It has mixed media of hand-drawn stuff, line work, CG, painted. There's sock puppets in it. I mean, like, it's just a lot of, there's like live action backgrounds and some of the green screen stuff that Katie makes her own films in. It's a love letter to creative people. Like, you really feel that the hand of the filmmaker for sure in this film. Like, it's above, you know, amongst all of them. I definitely feel it in this. It's the look.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I had heard about this movie for years. And so when I finally saw it, I was so blown away. Just, it was so creative. It was like a love letter to animation as a whole. And just all the different mixed media that they used just blew me away. And I think I was sold just right at the beginning when the dad is like screaming out of the car, and he like goes between being a howler, like a live action howler monkey, and then himself. And I was like, I love this. I love this so much. Like, I can't even with this. But just the, you know, for Sony, you know, making this film is really just kind of a step up and away from Spider-Verse, because Spider-Verse was such a unique look, and like they had to break their whole pipeline to make it, and it was so awesome and different. And then this movie just kind of grew off of that, and you know, they're doing a lot of the same kind of things, or they're just breaking everything and being super creative. And
I think it you know, for a studio, if I had to look at studios and say like the big ones like who's doing the most innovative, interesting stuff, it's Sony. Like for me, Spider-Verse, this was actually happened almost concurrently with Spider-Verse in a lot of ways. Like, so I think it got a lot of the benefit from Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who are the producers on this one as well, sort of pushing them, allowing the filmmakers to push the envelope and giving them the room to make this film. And it is, the big knock against modern computer graphic feature animated films is they all look the same. Like there's a desire for the hand feeling drawn quality, for it to feel more alive. And this film is a good example of it being infused back in, right? Taking the best of all the worlds and trying to like sort of create something unique and not being beholden to the pipeline. Like I think there was a driver 10, 20 years ago where the pipeline limitations and costs had to drive the creative solutions a little bit. And now that shift has happened where the creative is grappled it back over to their side. And not that the two are at odds, but there are limitations to technology that you have to accept on some level. And I think that has now the table has turned on that. And I think that's a great thing in this film, that really you can see it in this film. And it's really, really fantastic. The rule breaking, like it just breaks rules all the time throughout this movie, which is fantastic. I just think you look at the eyes, the eyeballs, just look at how they're not, quote, CG eyeballs. Like that's one of the knocks against CG characters. Like, oh, the eyes will look too realistic and they have all the depth inside the iris. And I can talk about all that stuff and the refraction and all this. And it like they're pretty simple, but they have a little bit of complexity on the edge if you look really closely at the eyes. But they look great and cartoony, and they're very emotive in a way that like maybe a traditional CGI isn't. So I think that's something that's really great about the character design. By the way, love the dog. Can we just talk about the dog for a second?
Holy the dog's cow. Amazing.
The dog steals the show, right? The dog's actually a plot point at how weird he looks. Like that's a plot point, right? That's how we defeat the robots. Is the dog looks weird? Like literally, the dog looks weird. That's why we win, right? It's just amazing. It's just kind of like crazy.
Well, and the character design too. I mean, it's so unique. It's so refreshing and different and quirky. It's fantastic. It's fantastic, and I loved what they called Katie vision. So like whenever Katie has like extreme emotions, either super happy or feeling down, it's like these 2D, elements like come out of nowhere, and you just feel it because you're like, oh my God, that is what it's like to be a teenager and have those feelings. You do feel like rainbows are shooting out of your brain. like I can feel that. And so I loved it. I loved this movie.
I think it's something that's pretty special from a design standpoint. So if I had to look at all these movies and I could only buy one art of book, I would buy this book. This is the one I would buy, I would say, because it's so unusual. And the production designer, Lindsey Alvarez, PDI alum.
PDI.
She sort of got discovered on this film. First time production designer. So I think Mike and Jeff reached out to her because they saw like an Instagram feed or something like that. It literally was something. She had worked in the industry. She'd worked at PDI, Pacific Data Images, but was living up, I think, in Northern California at the time. And when this all started, and they reached out to her, the filmmakers reached out to her because they liked her art. And then she started doing some character design stuff. So she first was character designer, but then became the production designer as the film went on. And that was a whole new role for her. And again, I think that's partly because of the pandemic that allowed for that ability to happen. And so I think the look of this film, you could point to the pandemic and point the opportunities it created. And certainly for Lindsey, it was a big opportunity, and she hit it out of the park, did a great job. She's a fantastic person. So that's awesome that it happened. But it's just one of those things that you can really feel how, given the opportunity, you can make something different if you look in the right places to find the people that you need. And I think they handpicked a bunch of people this way for this film.
I'm sure. Well, also, this just a side note, artists, get out on Instagram, post your work.
So it can happen. It can happen. It'll blow up. You can blow up.
A little Hollywood story.
Yes, that's right. A little Hollywood story for everyone that's not in the industry. But what a fantastic movie. I really enjoyed it. The car is great. The little family truckster station wagon. I think it's called Sensible. I think it's the Sensible model or something like that. It has some ridiculous name. It's really, really funny. I just think the movie is like, it is a funny movie. As the film, it's a movie about weirdos for weirdos. Like, so, and I say this in the most positive sense. Like, everyone feels like a weirdo, I think, to some degree. And so, like, there's something here that you can relate to for sure. There's a lot of nods to the films. So the filmmakers are huge fans of cinema. So I think you can see it in the movie, and like the robot design looks like the red eye of Hal's in the PAL robot. I mean, come on, like, there's a lot there to be like PAL. So.
Yeah, I think it. I mean, you can see it. I mean, it is such a love letter to filmmaking, but also just to animators too. Like the fact that, you know, she wants to go into this, you know, Cal Arts like kind of school. You know,
yeah, the oasis that she's going to, her college that she has to drive to. Yeah. And as a teenager myself, I can relate to the eye rolling of my teenager towards me if I were to suggest a road trip to his college eventually, which will come up in a few months. So
yeah.
that would not go over well with my son.
Maybe if there was a world apocalypse.
Maybe.
Like robot
apocalypse. But great film. Really, I had more. This is the film I had the most fun watching, I think, last year.
Yeah, agree. And the giant Furby.
Oh, Furby. I mean, come on.
You know,
but you have a giant Furby.
I'm in. Any film with a giant Furby. I'm in.
Yes, that's right. You got Camila Ganza, first ticket spot.
Yep, I'm first in line.
You both talked about the rule breaking that this film does, and Ken, you specifically mentioned how they designed the eyes. What else made this a rule breaking film, in your opinion?
You know, when Camille talks about the Katie vision of incorporating 2D line work into a 3D movie, that's not a simple thing. Like, that is, you know, for most pipelines, they don't like account for that. And I think that is something that was really, really embraced. There's a lot of fourth wall breaking that happens here, where like there's graphics that just appear in the screen, like that stuff almost always is kind of considered one-off in most pipelines. And so to see so much of it in this film was really, really fantastic. And usually you'll see a sequence or two that have it, but it's permeated throughout the DNA of the entire film. I think that alone is big. The combination of, it looked like there was something
mixed
animated,
media.
yeah, on 2D, on like with the 2D incorporation of like, yeah, I think there's some shots where like they literally put like a regular like a live action background in some of the like the footage. Like that is definite rule breaking for sure. I think some of it's animated on twos. Like, there's just a lot of different styles at work here. Usually there's a rule, like we're going to animate on twos or we're going to animate on ones. But this one does, we're going to do everything, you know, and that's what I mean by the kitchen sink approach. But it works for this film.
Yeah, if it serves the story,
right,
they're not afraid to do whatever they need.
Yeah, I think all of us can point to like films that seem to be like, oh, I can't decide what it wants to be. But this one wants to be a lot, but it feels right. Like, and I think that's what makes it work in this film. And like, I love that combination of different types of media in this movie. Like, it's just, and it feels right for the story it's telling about a filmmaker, someone who wants to be a filmmaker, right?
Yeah.
And from two people who obviously love cinema. Like, that's very clear when you watch the movie. Like, oh yeah, these guys love movies.
Yeah.
And it also shows, I think, to a large degree, how much in an animated film, how much the producer matters, because Phil Lord and Chris Miller, I think, have a lot of sway at a studio like Sony because they brought the Oscar to that studio. So I think they allowed a platform for these filmmakers to make this movie. Also, Kurt Albrecht, who was the Sony side producer, like, I'm sure it was hard for him. Like, so there's almost always in an animated film, a creative producer sort of shepherds the directors through, deals with talent and studio and executives. But then there's a boots on the ground producer who says, okay, you want to do all these things? Let me figure out how we're going to get this done. And that job on this film must have been super, super hard. I can't imagine how difficult that was for that person. I'm only projecting, but I'm guessing it must have been hard. And like, that's the stuff that you don't really hear about. Is the creative stuff's fantastic, but someone has to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, somebody has to track all those elements, the 2D, the CG, the live action.
Yeah, how do you communicate all of these things to the artists who have to make it and then, find a cost for it and justify that cost back to the studio? Like, that is not an easy task. And I would have to tip my hat to Kurt on that one, because I think it was a super challenging job, and it's worth it, because look at the product that came out here. This movie is amazing. But I imagine he got a lot of gray hairs while making this movie. Like that's what sometimes that's part of what goes through my mind when I see something like this. I'm like, oh, this has got to be a hard movie to make, man. Like I thought the same thing when I saw Spider-Verse. I'm like, wow, who was the producer on that movie? Because they lost some serious years in their life.
Well, the fifth film on our list is Flea, the Danish film that's nominated not only as animated feature, but also Best International Feature Film and Best Documentary Feature.
It's hard to talk about these 5 films together, in my opinion, because you have 4 films that are really for kind of a younger audience, the four quadrant audience. And then you have Flea, which I didn't really know that much about before watching it. And it blew me away. It blew me away so much that I have been like pressuring everyone I know to watch it. And I'm like, please watch it. I think it's so timely and so important. And if you don't know anything about it, you should. But it's this Danish film where, we follow this man, who it's not really his name, but he's a real person, and his friend, the director of the film, Jonas Rasmussen, has been recording his story, and they've been friends since they were 15 years old, and it's taken 20 plus years for Amin to get to a place where he feels comfortable telling his story. And it's so truthful, it's so powerful that it's on another level for me, and I have a really hard time grouping it with the rest of the films.
It definitely stands out in that way. Like it's also the only 2D animated film, completely 2D animated in this animation, but there's mixed media in this one as well. They combine it with archival footage of Afghanistan and these other places where he's been. On a purely technical level, the animation is great. It's really, really beautiful, well animated film. And like I said, it's 2D, which already stands out from the rest of it. It also, there's this question of why is it animated? And it could only be animated unless it was done as a drama or as a recreation, because it covers the life of where there couldn't have been cameras, where they couldn't have filmed it at all, right? And so it really exploits the animation medium, and I say exploit in a good way, in that it brings a story to life that could otherwise would not have been as effective. I feel that what happens here is there's a combination of these interviews in which Amin recounts his life, and then it cuts to recreations in animation of his life, obviously where they've done some research about what the houses look like, what people look like, and then made this amazing story, which is the story by itself is great. But then I think you add the animation and it adds another level to it that is hard to describe. And I think that's one reason why it's hard to talk about. But it's resonated with so many people. Just to give the viewers, the audience, a little bit of context, like it blew away everyone at Sundance last year. So there was a huge buzz at Sundance. It won an award there. It went to Cannes. It picked up, I don't even know when Riz Ahmed and Nicola Custer Walden became producers, but they became producers on it at some point. So it has a resonance that's hard to describe. And the fact that it's nominated in 3 categories says a lot about how not only is it powerful, but like how hard it is to encapsulate or to sort of put it into a category, right? Yeah. And the danger of being in 3 categories is it wins nothing, right? Because it gets votes in all 3. So you're like, it's like a hat trick, but you don't get the win. Like it's a weird thing for it, which I feel badly for it because of that. But at the same time, I think it's groundbreaking because it was nominated for those 3 categories. Like I think it's so great and worth seeing that I would urge people listening to the podcast to actually stop listening right now. Sorry, Gabe.
Yes,
go watch it right now.
Now. Seriously,
I will. Get back.
I agree. Please go see it. It's so good. It's so powerful, and it's so timely. I think just the story of this man who is trying to find his place in the world and his life, with his sexuality, with his marriage, with his, coming, to terms with his past and telling his friend his story. It's beautiful.
it's super complicated, like life is complicated. It's definitely not for kids. It would be hard for a kid to watch this and understand really what's happening. It's super timely because it is about a refugee from Afghanistan and the journey that he and his family take and sacrifice. And I think it's something that right now there's a lot of sacrifice because of the last couple of years. That I think almost everyone can relate to some idea of sacrifice for the better good and what it means to make sacrifice for family and and to keep people safe. It's very powerful. I've said that word like 1,000 times in this discussion, but I think it's like it's easily the most emotional of the group of films in terms of like just what it builds over time. I love the scene in which the refugees are on a boat and this cruise liner comes, like they're adrift, and it looks, that the guy makes it because he's telling the story, but you don't know what's going to happen. And this Norwegian cruise liner comes up, and it's a really powerful scene because they think it's everyone on the refugee boat's hopeful, but the people on the ship are like taking pictures with their phone and just sort of gawking at them. And you just don't know how that's all going to resolve. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what it's like. It's not like a Hollywood movie where in a Hollywood movie that ship would come up, they're all saved, but it's not quite that simple, And when you see these kinds of journeys, like in the live action equivalent, when you see a journey like The Killing Fields from many years ago, it's an experience where you try to put yourself in that position, and it's challenging to do it. It's challenging to put yourself in that position and to think about the choices that you would have to make in order to survive. And I think that's something about this film that is really amazing, and if somebody who listens to this season says they think it's great, is there more animated films like that? Watch Waltz with Bashir. That's another film from a few years ago that's like that, in that way of like, it's telling an adult story in an adult context, but using animation. So like, it just shows the ability for animation to actually work in an adult way. And not just the four quadrant film. I love those other films too.
Yeah.
This is a different kind of film. And I think that's what's great about having this category, is that you can afford this ability to look at different kinds of animated films. And this one definitely stands out because of that.
Animation is an art form, not a genre. I just always go back to that Brad Bird's quote, that you really can tell any story with animation. And I think that is the one problem with this category, is that people tend to just like lump in children's films to animation. And so this year I've been racking my brain, like, I don't know, maybe there should be like a children's one and the adult one, just to give films like this a chance. And also, it's extremely low budget. When you compare Disney or Pixar, like that is a huge like money-making machine where they poured like millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into making it, marketing it.
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions.
Yeah. Let's really be honest here.
And I think like Flea, I think I read like they had 10 animators.
That's crazy. I think only 10 animators on it. I mean, it made a buzz. Annecy is one of those festivals, animation festivals, that it made a huge buzz, won the big prize there. So it's won a lot of awards along the way, and well deserved.
Yeah. So go see it. You have to. Just please please go see it. Buy it. Write him a letter. Tell him how good it is.
Talk to me about the technique of starting with live action footage and then animating on top of it.
I don't think they did that, though.
I don't think they did. At least I didn't read that. Did you read that, Skid?
No, I mean, it seems like the interviews, there seems like there is possibly live footage that they've done, because you see the camera in some of the secondary shots.
That's true, when he's like laying down.
Where if you were animating from scratch, you might not have the camera, like when he's lying down on the prayer rug. For example, on the side shot, you see the camera above. Now, it's obviously not throughout the movie live footage, because as you mentioned, Kit, they go back in time, and sometimes they use different techniques like the shadow figures, you know, to create some of the emotion that he's experienced as a child. But I do, and again, not having read that much about it, and maybe it wasn't the case, maybe it's just that elements that they added in the animation, but I do think that they filmed actual interviews, and perhaps even some of the stuff around the house or when he's looking at the book is done with a camera before the animation comes into play.
I would actually, so along those lines, I bet that did happen. I bet they did shoot like a video camera, and maybe we're thinking about how they wanted to make the movie, and then ultimately decided to make an animated film. they may not have animated directly on top. They might have used it for the layout to like, oh, this is, to get the background right and the size of the characters and the perspective. But I think they hand animated the character itself and used the live action footage as reference. So there is a technique, it's sometimes called rotomation, in which you sort of basically make a rotoscopy of a live action, and you can run like in After Effects and some of these other compositing softwares, they have these automated tools to do that. I don't think they did that here. I think what they did is they used it as reference and sort of saw the subtleties in the movement and interpreted that movement in a hand-drawn way. Like that's what I would say happened. Probably sometimes that rotomation stuff, like if you watch Scanner Darkly, that the Linklater one, that uses a rotomation technique. So that's a very distinctive feeling. This does not, to me, have that feeling in it. So I don't think they use that technique.
Yeah, I think they definitely used it as reference, especially I'm just thinking of that last scene, how it goes from, being animated and then live action, and you kind of make that connection. Like, this is a real story, I mean, you've known this the whole film, but I think it just really kind of knocks it, out of the park at the end.
Yeah. I think that's a great choice too, to like that transition back into live action. So these are like, for the filmmaker making the movie, they're trying to think of ways to sort of connect it back. And I think that's another thing that's a tip of the hat to Jonas, is like the amazing way that he connects us back to a real thing. It's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I can't even with it. But I just like, as a side note, I think it's really interesting that all 5 of these films are really about like acceptance, about getting over some kind of like family trauma in a way, or drama. Like each one of them in their own way, like that is kind of the thread of this, which is very timely, I think, for all of our lives and for all of the viewers.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that they all have thematically, it's something, that thread that runs through them all, which is common.
Well, beyond this group of 5, were there other animated films from last year that caught your attention? Either of you want to give any shout outs?
Yeah. I'll give a big shout out to Summit of the Gods. Like that film for me was amazing. And that's another 2D animated film about climbing that I really, really enjoyed. I personally like climbing. I love Free Solo and I love all those kind of climbing stories. But it's really well done. And I found I think Japanese. I think it's Japanese. It won a lot of early awards, but sort of fell off the awards circuit track in the later part of the year. But I don't think it should be forgotten. I think it's a really, really well done animated film. I enjoyed it quite a bit. That's another one that it's unusual because it's another adult oriented. Mm-hmm. It's an animated film.
Yeah, I think Some of the Gods as well. But another one I was just thinking of that hasn't gotten enough attention, I think, is Vivo.
Another Lin-Manuel Miranda film.
He's got everything. But I thought it was really beautiful, and I think it's a really nice story. It's just one of those ones that I don't think has gotten as much traction, but I think the look of it is beautiful, and the music was nice, and just I really enjoyed it as a story.
So yeah, it's another Lin-Manuel Miranda sort of, that guy can't be stopped. He just can't be stopped.
Can't stop, won't stop.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yes. Thank you, Camila. But that was another Sony film. It was it is a beautiful film. The production designer, Carlos Zaragoza, amazing. Another PDI alum.
Another PDI.
Yes, I'm going to shout out there. But he did I think the production design is fantastic on that film. It's really, really beautiful. And it's one that sort of weirdly got a little overshadowed. I think maybe Sony had to pick somebody a horse to back. Sometimes that happens, and I think that they, for whatever reason, they for good reasons, they picked Mitchell's is a great film. But at the same time, don't want to forget the other great ones. And I think that's Vivo is a really great film. It has a lot of great sort of these fantasy sequences in the middle of it, which are fantastic. Beautiful. Just like kind of these 2D-ish, 2.5D.
So gorgeous.
Yeah, they're really beautiful. Sort of high concept. Again, that's a production design. Beautiful, well done, great.
Good job, everyone.
Well, this has been great. Really appreciate you guys coming and sharing your insights on these films. And we'll see what's in store for 2022.
Right.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Skid. Really enjoyed talking to you about these movies.
Yeah, make sure you watch Flea again.
Listeners, that's all. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, please visit our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's BIZ. It's easy to peruse past episodes, and you'll find links to all of our social media. That includes our page on IMDb, where, as I mentioned earlier, you can learn more about my guests. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and all of you for sticking with us. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends. We'll be back with more Oscars Insights next week.